Today, we welcome Warren Merkel, who serves as leader of the Standards Services Group in the Standards Coordination Office of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Programs under his responsibility include engagement with government agencies on standards and conformity assessment issues and operation of the World Trade Organization's Technical Barriers to Trade Inquiry Point for the United States. Mr. Merkel also serves as co-convener of ISO-CASCO Working Group 44 on the revision of ISO-IEC 17025 general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories. Warren will be presenting on the topic of the role of standards development within a quality infrastructure framework. We look forward to your questions and engagement during the presentation, and I'll be tracking the chat as we go along. And so please post your questions there or send me a private chat as we go along. Thanks so much. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Warren.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Thanks for the opportunity. And thanks to everyone for joining the webinar. I look forward to talking to some real experts in the group. So I think this can be quite interactive, and I hope to learn as much from you as you get from the webinar. So with that, Karen, if you want to jump to the next slide, just a way to start thinking about this. Infrastructure. It's a word that will come up through this discussion a lot. It's in the title of the talk, but I was wondering if anybody's willing to speak up or put into the chat what first comes to mind when you see the word infrastructure or when you think about infrastructure generally. Yeah, buildings, engineering, transportation as well. When we think about, particularly in our country and the political climate, there's a lot to be discussed in infrastructure and spending related to systems like transportation and building. Product life cycle also is part of the infrastructure thinking, systems generally. And when we think about infrastructure in all of those contexts, it's really the underpinning elements of a system or any overall organization that provides the support for that organization to function and be successful. So we're talking today about quality infrastructure, and that's really the basis for the discussion around what it takes to have that successful basis for implementing a overall quality infrastructure in a company, through to a country, and to regions of the world. Next slide. So what I hope to talk about a little bit is when we use the term quality infrastructure in particular. I'll give you a basic definition of it, go through the elements of quality infrastructure, and then next item that we'll talk about is the role of standardization in particular within the quality infrastructure, knowing that I'm talking to the women in standards. So we'll talk about standards in particular. And then I'll close with some current and future challenges and opportunities when we talk about standardization within the quality infrastructure discussion. Again, along the way, I'm hoping for this to be interactive. It's a relatively small group, and I know some of you know more about this than I do. So as we move forward, I look forward to your input. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about quality infrastructure and how it's defined at the current time in the international context, particularly around trade and development. When I first started hearing about quality infrastructure, there were three pillars. It was metrology, standardization, and accreditation. And that was a really cool representation, because you could think about it as the three legs of a stool. And if you remove one of the legs of the stool, all of the rest fall over. As thinking around the elements of quality infrastructure and what's involved in related activities, they've added a fourth pillar for conformity assessment, recognizing that conformity assessment often occurs without accreditation being part of the process. And so it's a very important part of the quality infrastructure. I'll go through each of these terms in illustrate just the importance of standardization through a few examples as demonstrating how standardization really is the thread that connects the pillars to each other. And don't tell the metrologists at NIST, but I think from a very basic perspective, standardization really is at the core of the quality infrastructure generally. If you think about standards for the performance requirements or characteristics for a product, so in the standardization column there in the middle, that's the basis for determining what measurement capabilities are necessary. We need to know what the characteristics of the products or services are going to be so that we understand what metrology needs we have. Conformity assessment is determining whether specified requirements are met. So in that context, the standard is the most important part of determining how to do the conformity assessment. If you don't have the standards and requirements, then you can't, by definition, even do conformity assessment. And then finally, accreditation serves a lot of purposes. One of the main purposes of accreditation, though, is to communicate to users of the accredited conformity assessment bodies what they're competent to do. And so in that development of a scope of accreditation, it's critical to identify the standards that are associated with that conformity assessment body's competence. That thread of standardization works completely all the way through the infrastructure in that example. The challenge that we have when we talk about quality infrastructure and matching our US standardization system with the rest of the world, most other economies around the world are more of a top-down approach. So in those economies, there's a single or very few standards bodies that are at the top of the system, and they determine what standards will be made. Our US approach is different. We let the market decide how to establish the appropriate standards to be used both domestically and internationally. It's a bottoms-up system. So the market decides which standards are going to be used, and there's a lot of options. So I want to spend some time here on the challenges and opportunities and then open it up for some discussions. Some of this, we've all heard this before. This isn't news to standards professionals, but standards development takes time. Good standards take time. And as I illustrated earlier, the fact that standards are so critical to all of the elements of the quality infrastructure means the standards need to be right. However, if you think about those pillars of the quality infrastructure, some of them are more agile. If you think about it, once you have a standard, once you have a scheme, conformity assessment bodies will tell you that they can conformity assess against the standard in the scheme. Just ask them, they'll tell you. They're very good at it. If there's a need for accreditation, if there are good standards and the conformity assessment bodies with competence, the accreditation can happen. But the standards often are one of the time limiting factors for moving this forward. I think when we look at the metrology also takes time, but often the metrology institutes are trying to work ahead of the needs of industry to ensure that by the time a sector is ready for standardization, the metrology is there to support it. But that standards development process and the time that it takes would allow, in some cases, delays for the quality infrastructure to effectively bring products to market. Now, where's some opportunities here? There's a lot of emerging technology, bright, shiny objects coming along. And so we are at a point in time when having new areas of technology, new industries, you can use all of the AI, quantum, advanced communications. We are very active right now in developing standards and conformity assessment and metrology for all of those areas. So these standards will be developed now. And so we don't have the fact that we've got in other fields where the standards were made a long time ago and just get reviewed and recycled. These are brand new areas of standardization, an opportunity to address those issues around representation. to address the need to ensure that all of stakeholders have access, and to take the challenge of doing standards in a time frame that's responsive to the market's needs, to make sure that standards are timely and support the other pillars of quality infrastructure effectively. When we think about some of the parts of the quality infrastructure, in particular around some of these emerging technology areas, metrology takes on another aspect of importance when it comes to the basis for the standardization and how you measure things like the quality of data that are used to train a machine learning system, and ensuring that the information there is sound. So that's a huge opportunity. The whole world's at the same place. We in the US are doing our very best to be at the forefront of standardization and quality infrastructure broadly around those technology areas. But we're all in this at this point, starting at a very similar place. And so it's a huge opportunity to make sure that those issues are being addressed in standardization.
Let me thank you for the end of the recording for the great presentation and information for women in standards. Certainly appreciate your comments on the need for diversity and diverse views contributing to the standards development process. And for those attending today, thank you for joining us and participating in the conversation. Please visit the Women in Standards website to see our other events, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.